Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for being able to come and join us here today. This is the last day of the London Build Station. Tomorrow is our demo day. But don't worry, we're back again. And this has been an awesome place for everyone to be able to come together, building for the Colosseum, a hackathon. And today I'm excited to be able to welcome Thomas from Jido, who's their Chief Commercial Officer, to dive into a little bit about his story and what he's kind of seeing out in the market, especially from the institutional point of view, and kind of diving into how that can be applied to any of the founders building here today. So, Thomas, why don't you just first give a little bit of introduction about yourself and tell everyone a bit about what you've been doing with Jido.
Yeah, well, hello, everybody. I feel like I'm probably aimed in the wrong direction. Sorry if you're staring at the back of my head. It's not a very good look. So I'm Tom. I joined Jido about 6 weeks ago. Before that, I was at a trading firm called Jane Street. I was there for 22 years. I was part of the team at Jane Street that started looking at crypto in 2017. And I was part of that team until second quarter of 2023 is when Jane Street was kind of scaled back a lot of their crypto ambitions on the back of a lot of the U.S. regulatory enforcement. And so I stayed at Jane Street, but I started working on helping us build out our exotic options business, which is a very, very different line of business than digital assets, crypto, however you want to call it. And I realized that, I missed the space. And so I left Jane Street at the beginning of the year. I'll be honest, I'd never even heard of Jido before when I left. And a big chunk of what I was trying to do is actually learn all of the stuff that had changed in the space in the 18 months where I was kind of focused on other things at Jane. Things like, Hyperliquid and Athena and Jido and places like that. So yeah, I kind of got brought into Jido because of Rebecca Rettig, who's the chief legal officer. I was talking to her, and she mentioned that she was joining this group, and one of the projects she was working on was specifically around ETFs. Like, in a world where Stake Solana lives inside of an ETF, how can Jido get involved in those conversations? What would need to be built in order to kind of be a value add in that ecosystem? And having been in Jane Street as long as I have, Jane Street is very well known for being an ETF shop. I just started helping out, joining a few calls, providing some IP as to why staking inside of an ETF is hard. And one thing led to another. Once I got to see the team in action and meet everybody, it became a pretty easy sell in the end. And so, in addition to the ETF stuff, which we're working on we're spending a lot of effort on, there's this broader question about how do you create the value proposition with a fundamental goal of expanding the user base of Solana. Because I think the one thing that everybody in the Solana ecosystem is very well aligned, regardless of what project you're working on, regardless of whether you're working on the protocol itself or whether you're working on the application layer. The only way that where this becomes a viable project is if the user base grows over the next few years. And so, I think Jido has a role to play in that, as well as anybody else kind of in the ecosystem. A lot of the projects that you guys are building is kind of directly geared towards solving this issue. And so, there will come a time where, projects are competitive, but we're not even close to that period in the life cycle, as far as I'm concerned. Like, I think it's still so early that everybody is very, very much on the same page. How do we grow the user base?
And when you talk about you've been in the space since 2017 when you started and then expanding into it, what's your perception on just what Web3 does? Why it's valuable? Because you probably have maybe a different perspective than someone like the founders here from how they're building from their point of view.
Yeah. Going back to 2017, I remember in 2018, there was a lot of rhetoric around, the institutions are coming. And obviously, it was a very, very different kind of environment, because what ended up happening is there was some reaction to kind of the activity, particularly with respect to price, but it wasn't sticky on the institutional level. Like, Goldman hired Justin Schmidt, who now runs Ondo, to be like the head of digital assets, and it was like a big thing. He was wearing like a man bun at the time and stuff, because that was what was kind of projected as this is what a crypto guy looks like. But as soon as as soon as the downturn happened, a lot of those people disappeared. But I think that fundamentally things have changed a lot on that end, in the sense that every single major financial institution has people working on crypto and has a designated head of digital assets. And those people have been much more resilient in the face of even kind of the most recent downturns in price. And so the activity on the institutional level has decoupled from price in a very, very material way. The other thing is that, I was responsible at Jane Street for kind of growing the business horizontally, in the sense that, when we started looking at digital assets, a big part of my job was saying, okay, there's all of this noise in the space. There's all these people building stuff. How do we figure out which of the stuff is real, which of the stuff that we could plug into, which of the stuff that we could leverage, and which of the stuff is being built that will help advance the institutional story? There's lots of institutional blockages as to, how they would get involved in the space. And so I spent a lot of time reaching out, talking to a lot of crypto projects. And then we started getting inbound inquiries from institutions saying, okay, well, what does market structure look like? How is it evolving? How would I execute? What does liquidity look like? Market depth, things like that. And, I became the natural person to kind of talk to them. But what would happen is, like, people were so early stage at that point that they would come to talk to us about kind of market structure and liquidity, but then go, okay, well, I know that I can trade with you, but how do I actually store these tokens? Like, how do I do TCA, or transaction cost analysis? How do I make sure that the tokens are clean? And so, because I was having conversations with all the other people in the crypto space, I would be the one, when talking to the institutions, to say, well, if you were looking for custody solutions, you should talk to these guys. If you're looking for blockchain provenance, you should talk to these guys. And so what ended up happening is there's like informal referral networks that started emerging in the institutional space. But so, sorry, so many words. The top level is that, so I spent a lot of time on the institutional part of crypto. And as part of that, I saw a lot of stuff happening in DeFi, but I ultimately treated it as a distraction from an institutional standpoint. Because DeFi, for a very, very, very long time, was just so unfriendly to institutions in some very fundamental ways, that all of this cool stuff was happening in DeFi. But I sort of had the luxury, or maybe the ignorance, to ignore them. And so all of the stuff that was happening in ICOs, and then NFTs and memes, like institutions, a lot of the things that are attractive to crypto people, especially crypto people who've been in the space from early on, things like censorship resistance and things like privacy and things like that. Like, this is just not relevant for institutional conversations. And so when you think about DeFi being able to kind of democratize access, you can just spin up a wallet and connect and utilize these resources. This is just not how institutions were going to operate. Like, just the idea of opening a wallet at an institution, like, involves a lot of people from lots of different teams, a lot of coordination, a lot of approvals. So anybody who's going to, it's just a very, very far reach to set up the basic infrastructure for institutions to access DeFi applications, in addition to all the KYC, KYT, all that stuff that was happening. So I'm not super conversant on DeFi, but obviously at Jito, my attention has shifted, and my opinion on these projects have shifted a lot.
And so when we're then diving into those specific use cases, those killer cases that the institutions like, actually this does have real value.
Yeah.
If we look at where we are now in 2025 versus when we were in 2018, the space has matured a lot.
Yeah.
You've seen people tokenizing the money market funds. There's a lot of more applications that are now available, and institutions are able to be adopting these type of technologies.
Yeah.
What are you seeing that's the killer use case that is affecting, and or even like the first ones that the institutionals will start to be able to play with in this space?
I don't know that there's a killer use case from an institutional standpoint. Like, institutions are by definition going to be a little bit slow, and so the use cases that emerge today are the ones that become like the applications for tomorrow. I will say that my kind of thesis a couple of years ago was that crypto, or DLT, or however you want to describe it, was going to fundamentally change the world, but in the most boring ways possible. So, things like freeing up intraday collateral. So there's this project called Patan, which is used to do essentially what's settlement compression for FX. And this is a very, very big deal. This is because it's designed to address something called Herstatt risk. Herstatt was a bank, like maybe in the 80s, I think, who was a big bridge between Deutschmarks and US dollars. But because they opened in the morning, they took in a bunch of deposits. They were supposed to pay out dollars when the Fed window opened, but they went bust in between like the open of the day and the time the Fed window opened. And so there was all of this unsettled risk that emerged in FX because this bank failed. And so Herstatt risk in FX is just this idea of like, how do we make sure that we eliminate the counterparty risk that's inherent in essentially free of payment systems, where somebody has to send out something and then receive something later in the day. There's a system called CLS, which is owned by the Bank of International Settlements. It's basically like a collaboration with a bunch of central banks to do what's called settlement compression, which is you send all of your transactions and then they essentially net off like within each of the different banks. And so the amount that you actually have to send out is much smaller. This is also how precious metals settle, by the way. And so anyway, Baton is a blockchain-based system. It is being trialed by people as large as HSBC and Wells Fargo that does the settlement compression, but does it intraday. And freeing up of intraday collateral for banks is absolutely huge. And so this is something that, that blockchain technology fixes. But there's a lot of things. There's other kind of more material, more visible ways in which blockchain is fundamentally changing things. The U.S. has gone from T2 to T1 settlement, and people are now talking about being able to settle T0. T plus is the number of days after which you do a trade that the trade settles. And so now in the U.S., like, we do a trade today and it settles tomorrow. And the only way that this is happening is because of the atomic settlement in crypto has shown people that there's a better way to operate. The fact that U.S. stocks can now trade 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, is largely a function of the innovations that have happened in crypto. And so there are some very significant wins for crypto that are being adopted by TradFi today. I don't know if you would call them like killer apps or use cases or anything like that. I think it's pretty clear, at least from my perspective, that the one killer app of crypto is stablecoins, and the ability to transmit money from one person to another, like almost instantaneously at low cost, which, ironically is like the point of the white paper, like the Bitcoin white paper was designing a payment system where you could transfer value without the use of an intermediary.
Yep.
And so stablecoins kind of is, from a very pure standpoint, like a success of that vision.
100%. And when we're then talking about here a couple of these opportunities, so talk about Baton and how they was able to do the compression in the number of settlements, and when we're exploring these little payment solutions that bank can be able to do, I'm curious for any of the founders here who are building an institutional product, or that's their target audience, is that they believe that in speaking to a bunch of different people, there is this problem currently in the system, and they have a solution that could be able to offer it. Would you better share a little bit more about what the deal cycle looks like for being able to close and bring on some of these institutional partners? Because you talked about earlier before about how even creating a wallet has to go through multiple different people. Like the deal cycles are a lot longer than just quickly a little Telegram group, speaking to the person, bang, you've done it in a couple hours, and it's announced the next day. You know, there's a whole different journey that it goes to working with institutions. If you could share some of your experiences that you found.
Yeah, working with institutions is hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like, institutional speed is so different than crypto speed. Like, things move really slow until they move fast, but things move really slow for a really long time. So in terms of the deal cycle, I don't have a lot to, like, if you look at some of the huge M&A that's happening right now, like, those people have been building for the better part of a decade, 6-7 years. Like, the Deribit guys have been working for 6-7 years building that product, maybe probably longer. Hidden Road has been working for a very, very long time. Like, so in terms of the deal cycle, I don't have a lot other than don't get discouraged. It just takes a long time in order to kind of have these conversations and break in to the right people. What I will say, that something that is really helpful is being very, very clear about who you are targeting and what the value proposition is. So, the idea of, or the word institutions in crypto has been so overused that it's basically functionally lost all meaning. Like, institutions is like this amorphous group that kind of exists in the background. Like, you can, that they're there, that they're powerful, but you're not exactly sure how you can talk to them. I think it is more, so I think it's really valuable for you to sit down and or break down like who you are actually talking to within the institutional universe. And I think something that might be helpful is understanding some of the factors that differentiate institutions. And so if you think about things like domicile, that's a big deal. Like, it's much easier for a sovereign wealth fund in the UAE to get access to crypto today than it is for, even a simple like investment advisor in the US. It's just a much easier conversation for them because there are much fewer. There's much cleaner. The rules of the road in terms of what they can and can't do are much clearer in certain domiciles. I think when it comes to fiduciary responsibility, that's another one. Like, if you are talking to people who manage other people's money, it is a much bigger lift than if you're talking to somebody that is managing their own. And so if you're talking to like a hedge fund, it's a much cleaner kind of line to a decision than if you're talking to somebody who manages the money for, the teachers in Ontario or the firefighters in Texas. And I think this is rational. Like, a lot of the consumer protections exist not for you guys. It exists for like your parents or your aunts and uncles that you guys have tried to like get to set up a wallet, and you understand how hard it is to get them to kind of interact with the space in the most basic ways. So if you're talking to somebody who manages their money, they make different decisions than they do if they're managing their own. And so understanding, like, are you talking to somebody who is a money manager or is somebody who is an allocator themselves? The centralization is also a big deal. Like, I think you guys have all experienced this. You've talked about this. You alluded to this earlier. Like, and this is somewhat ironic, but the level of centralization in terms of decision making is hugely impactful on their ability to interact with crypto. So if you have somebody that has a very lean, centralized decision-making structure, it's much easier to have those conversations than for somebody who works in a large but decentralized organization, where in order to get a project passed, you have to get approvals from all of these different departments, or worse, all of these different departments have a veto over this process moving forward. And when I say like different teams, legal and compliance and cybersecurity and operations and tech and things like that. Because like if you are you can imagine if you're a money manager, how are you going to meet a margin payment at midnight on Saturday? In order for you to do that, you have to recognize that margin payment is due, but you have to have somebody who is authorized to move funds for the company, who is at work at midnight on a Saturday. And if you work at these big organizations, like the people who are working at midnight on Saturday are like, no disrespect, are like the junior guys. And those are not the guys who are going to be authorized to do a $100 million margin payment anywhere. So, but if you have somebody at the top, you have Michael Saylor or Abby Johnson or somebody like that, and they say, or somebody at one of these kind of large trading firms or hedge funds that says, we need to be in crypto. Like if Noah says, oh, we need to set up Solana, like the organization will just fall in line. And so if you're dealing with an organization that has a centralized decision-making structure, you're going to have an easier conversation or a faster conversation than if you're dealing with somebody who's more decentralized. And so the way that we're thinking about this at Jito, we're acknowledging all this, but we've kind of split up the universe into more TradFi looking buckets. And so the buckets that we're looking at are, again, in TradFi terms, the buy side. So buy side in TradFi is like the ultimate investors, the allocators, the ones who, who make the investment decisions. They're the ones who do the investment. And so for them, you're looking at like pension funds or RIAs or, investment allocators, these large institutional kind of pools of money. So that's one area that we're targeting. The second one is sell side. And the way that I think of them is like on the distribution side. They provide the services to the buy side that allow the buy side to express their investment objectives. So these are like prime brokers, these are banks, these are exchanges, these are intermediaries who provide services for the buy side. Because the pitch to the buy side is very, very different than the pitch to the sell side. The pitch to the buy side is hard, but that's the one that moves the needle the most. And for Solana, the pitch to the buy side is not something that Jito can do on its own. It's very reliant on other people. But it's like, what is the investment thesis for Solana? What are the use cases for Solana? How is Solana going to grow? There are things that Jito can talk about, which is like, if you are a long-term holder of Solana, it's much better for lots of reasons. Not better, I shouldn't say better, but by expressing your investment objectives using Jito Sol instead of Solana, you get more convexity because of the total return. It's much, much lower maintenance. It's tax efficient, things like that. So we can have some of those conversations, but ultimately we need the support of the whole institution. On the sell side, how do we make selling this easier to the buy side? Well, you talk about, you can use, for instance, in the Jito case, you can use Jito Sol as yield-bearing collateral. And the idea of using yield-bearing collateral versus cash is just, everybody agrees, is just so far superior. Just because you can post the collateral, you can use it, but you're collecting yield on the back end. You're continuing to earn even while you're using that, that Jito Sol to do other activity. You have questions about like, what is the security status of Jito Sol? What are the tax implications of using Jito Sol? Things like that. The more support that you can provide to the sell side, the easier it is for them to serve as a distribution channel. And then there are people that kind of sit in between that actually are kind of indifferent to the investment case, but serve as like the fundamental architecture of markets. Trading firms I put in there, but also like custodians, clearinghouses, people like that. And the pitch to them is also very, very different than the buy side and the sell side. So just be very, very clear who you're selling to and why your services are valuable. Build to the need of the use case, and then grind.
Yeah. So being able to notice that the buy and the sell side of those different companies, the buy side are the people allocating funds, making those decisions, the sell side's giving them the resources that they need to execute on those goals. And then you kind of have these like clearing houses and middle people who can also be able to sell to.
Sell sides, you can also think of them as they're the ones who reduce the friction.
And when you're now looking at, you talk even a bit about how Jido's kind of position in this, looking at either that buyer sell side, and you're being able to share with them, hey, here's different products that work best for you that you could be looking into, so that they're collateralized loans you can get off of a yield bearing token Jido Sol for the sell side, and for the buy side, just like why you want to even be holding this asset as a whole. When you talk about the ecosystem helping to do this, and overall, like Solana, this is a united front that we need to be able to put forward. Like, what would you say are some of the key things that you want to see from the ecosystem standing forward, whether that be from a public facing or products being built or people being able to push on? What would you ideally like to see when you're now crafting and having these conversations with these institutions, that you have this like ammo to be able to go into those combos with?
That is a good question. I don't know. So I think that there's a lot of things that could be potentially useful. But I think first and foremost, like having builders recognize that they're all rowing in the same direction, as opposed to kind of this internecine like fighting within the protocol, I think is really, really helpful. Because certainly Jido has competitors on the staking side. They will have competitors on the on the block builder side. They will have I mean, there are competitors. They're just, all the competitors are going to get better, is what I meant. And there's structural changes that are happening in Solana, like the multi-leader or multiple concurrent leaders and things like that. That are kind of fundamentally change the way that Jido interacts with the space, like on the technology side. But to focus on them being competitors, I think is a bit of a mistake. Jido Sol is the largest liquid staking token on Solana by every metric. But these other liquid staking tokens have real customers. They are building the case with their customer base that staking on Solana is a superior way to hold Solana for lots of reasons. All of the different all of the different, all of the exchanges, the DEXs and the aggregators, and all the meme coin platforms, whatever. Like, everybody is on the same page. The more that you can increase confidence in the functioning of Solana at all times, the more you can get people aware of the utility of holding Solana. The more that you build use cases for them to leverage their Solana holdings to do other things, it just grows the pie. And that's the only thing that I think that matters right now. And so don't focus too much on what other people are doing. I think the main thing is to say, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and how do we solve this in the most effective way?
And I think it's quite powerful when you talk about not seeing each other as competitors, but that mindset of growing the pie. Because we talked about earlier on how we just need to grow the industry. Like, to really go to that next level, it's all about being able to open those doors and have many other players get involved. And that's these big institutional players. There's also many more retail players being able to get in. But then all of these different founders who are building out these products, new solutions, are then really helping bring on board new different types of people so that we can continue to grow the pie. And I think it's a nice comparison between the Solana ecosystem and like more the EVM ecosystem, where the EVM is fragmented across all of these.
We're not going to get tribal now, right?
And it's something where there's because each conversation that you go into, there's different ways that you want to collaborate. So like, even on like policy conversations, on regulatory point of views, where you talk about the industry as a whole, it's best to come as a united effort. it's best to come like across to them, because then you're not shown as being tribe. You are shown as like, hey, no, we're spokespeople for the industry as a whole. And then I think that's also part of why the EVM fragmentation hasn't been helpful, is because all of those conversations get split, and from even the bottom up side, the talent gets split as well between it. Where Solana's always been able to kind of like create that space where everyone can come together. We'll be Accelerate next week in New York. You'll have Breakpoint in Abu Dhabi. You've got all of the Apex events across it, always to bring all of those competitors into the same room to talk about, okay, what is in the next stage? How are we consistently growing this entire ecosystem and making sure that the pie is getting larger so more people can eat?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that there's no end state. Like everything here is built on kind of iteration. Everything is built on improvements, and everything, the thing that is wonderful for me to see is like the amount of experimentation that happens in this space. Because that is like the things that does for your intellectual curiosity, like where there's no artificial boundaries or barriers for you to do the things that you think are useful, is just really, really, really important. And it's actually core to what we did at Jane Street. Like the way that I described Jane Street, and part of the reason why I think Jane Street is successful is because if I were to describe what Jane Street's like, what Jane Street is good at, in the simplest way that I can, is I would say that Jane Street was a very Bayesian firm. And so if you're not familiar with Thomas Bayes' conditional probability, the probability of inputs change the probability of outputs. In order for that process to work well, two things, well, more than two things, but two things have to be true. One is you have to acknowledge that you do not have all of the information that is contained within a system, right? In order for you to be a good Bayesian updater, you have to acknowledge that there's knowledge that exists that is not within your head or within your current universe of knowledge. The second thing is that you have to update anytime new information comes in. And it doesn't matter where the information comes from. It doesn't matter if it comes from the most junior person, the intern who just started last week, or somebody who's been at the firm for 25 years. You just care about the quality of the information. Otherwise, you run the risk of doing things like ignoring Wall Street bets, for instance. Like there is just new information that comes in. You have to be able to incorporate the new information whenever it enters your sphere. So in order to do that, you have to be intellectually humble. You don't know everything, and you need to be intellectually curious. How can I improve my information set? And this is what crypto is amazing at. Like people build stuff, and then other people say, well, what if we took this and then made this change? Is that an improvement? And then you see constant iteration, constant building on what you guys are doing. And I don't know this personally, I'm inferring that this can be really hard part of being a founder, because you're creating, especially if you're doing stuff that's open source, you're creating something that can easily be forked and then somebody else takes credit. And then you also have this situation now where a few years ago the huge benefit of DeFi was composability. Like you can assemble a financial system using all of these different parts. But the trend today is towards like verticalization. Like instead of doing that, like instead of using this as a DEX and this as a lending protocol, like somebody says, oh, I'll just build this on top of my thing. And so now you have projects that are running like more verticals as opposed to the composability part, right? Like you're running a DEX, you're realizing that you're having a lot of success because pump.fun, and then you say, oh well, we should have a launchpad instead of the launchpad working well with the DEX and all that stuff, right? So, oh my God, I've lost the I totally lost the thread. What was the question?
Well, we were just going into the kind of direction and where you kind of like start to see the things piecing together, and how it is like an interesting point on the idea that crypto as a whole should have this composability. Towards it, everyone should work together, we're talking before about like difference between competitors and collaborators, and that kind of mindset difference between that and where you want to be able to put forward and be able to make sure whenever you're having conversations that you can show like a united front, and we want to be able to consistently taking those conversations to grow the pie and go to that next stage.
Yeah, and it's going to be frustrating because the thing that you build today that is like a dominant force in markets, if you've built it right, the value of that should decay over time. So the only way that you can kind of continue to be successful is by continuing to iterate yourself, and because otherwise the space is going to iterate for you. And that is scary, but at the same time, it's like the job is never done. There's no end state. Like, and if we're all doing our jobs well, like the world in 3 months is just going to work much better than the world today. And that's okay. But you have to build for a world where your product is never going to be finished.
That's beautifully said. Would we have any questions for Tom before we close it off? Because being able to think about things from that lens of always iterating, always improving, is something that every founder should be striving to do. Like constantly learning from their users, from their customers. What do they really want? What do they need? When we even talk about before about the institutional perspective of knowing, are you going after the buy side or sell side? Really constantly diving deeper into who's actually utilizing this, why are they getting beneficial, and that's part of like the iterational process of being able to constantly make sure that what I've built is of value to the market. And then if I keep building on it, the market continue valuing it accordingly, so that I'm able to continue to grow and we can be able to build better and better products.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Yeah, for the live stream.
Okay. First off, thanks for all that. That was amazing. Great to listen to, because you don't really hear a lot of those kind of views around very often.
Okay.
We kind of follow social media a lot more, and it's very difficult to get reasoned and balanced views on social media. Just to see the most recent scandal, right?
Oh my God, I've just joined. It's,
and also, I guess it was before your time, but thanks for the Jito airdrop. That was great. My question is, you talked about verticalization, right? Jito, and I think there's a couple of buckets. It's not the same business, but Etherfi and others, they've absolutely nailed the vertical they're in. And now they're starting to go a bit horizontal. Does Jito have plans to do horizontal moves as well? Or is it kind of focused on purely increasing the kind of, I guess, the distribution of the Jito product?
That's a good question. And I'm going to have the worst answer of anybody at Jito. Nick probably has a better answer to this than me. So I think that, Jito is continuing to evolve. Jito is continuing to grow. It's growing across multiple axes. Like there's certainly on the technology front, there's a lot of changes. Solana is not standing still, so Jito can't stand still. In terms of the product suite, the most recent focus has been on restaking, and so the ability to kind of use JTO, the governance token, and use it to boost the security of the products that you guys are building on. And so I think that it's creating a flexible framework, so the outcomes are not predefined. It's largely like what can be built on top of it. And I think if we've built it correctly, it's going to be totally agnostic to like the things that you guys built. It just has to be a flexible tool for you guys to use. So I'm not exactly sure what direction that's going to go in. And from the restaking side, that's probably the part of the business that I know the least, which is saying a lot because I know nothing about how the block engine works. But I do know that, like a large part of this is like, how do we actually grow? Again, going back to how do we grow the utility of the ecosystem? And by making it more flexible, we're removing constraints or we're removing barriers for other people in terms of the things that they have to build in order to kind of get their project off the ground. So that's how I would look at it. Do you have anything to add?
I'm going to ask you a question as well, but I'll just like...
I don't know. We're working on it.
I think to sort of iterate on that point a little bit, I think what Tom said was right. We've got the restaking piece that's opened up that is just developing and is going to be I think that's going to be an interesting substrate for, across blockchains, right? And the way Tom phrased it is right, that Jito's kind of like fundamental infrastructure for Solana that allows people to do that lateral expansion into other speeds, but it's very fundamental. We're talking right at the validator level. There's movements happening. You might have seen yesterday that the schedulers for like ANZ have just released new schedulers at the basic block building level. We'll be making some moves on that front as well, and so really fundamental infrastructure to the network itself. Jito is establishing itself and its reach there. Outside of that, there's it's about driving greater utility into both Jito Sol and the token. So I've just started as head of governance, and the first thing that I'm going to be sort of responsible for shepherding forward is enhancing the token economics. So Jito generates an incredible amount of rev. The DAO sort of collects $30 million of annualized fees. How do we use that and leverage that as an ecosystem in both for value accrual into the token economy, but also expanding the growth of the network? So yeah, I think there's it's about building fundamental infrastructure that both makes Jito better, but Solana better as well, like a network level thing. So the question I was going to ask you, Tom, was you mentioned that institutions are like slower, right? And I thought it was very interesting to point out that it's actually the centralized ones that might help the decentralized technology move forward, which is kind of interesting paradox.
Yeah.
When we were at the Digital Assets Summit last week, Financial Times event, very suity. I'm used to being at like cypherpunk events and things like that. But I felt that they were about 4 years behind the curve around, in terms of what they were talking about it felt like being in the past, about 4 years in the past. Do you imagine that gap closing over time, or do you think the institutions are always going to institution?
Our institution's always going to institution. Yes, but so I don't know. I think it depends on the type of institution that you're talking about. Like fundamentally, if you are a boring money manager, if you're Vanguard, there's very little reason for you. Like, I don't want Vanguard to be sexier. I just want them to do low cost indexing. And for those guys, they're still, very hesitant on, and maybe that's okay. But there's a lot of parts of the institutional kind of space that are very competitive markets. Like ETFs have launched, and now you can get ETFs for every single corner of the crypto market that you want. You can get leverage. You can get access to kind of a very, very wide variety of coins and strategies and things like that. And so there are pockets when the incentives are based on competition, I think you're going to see much more movement, much faster. And so there's a lot of, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, like Morgan Stanley, who is among the most conservative of the investment banks when it comes to crypto, they announced that E-Trade was going to, they were going to allow E-Trade customers to trade crypto. That feels very, very much like a reaction to the success that Robinhood is having. And fundamentally, the competition story there is Morgan Stanley runs this very significant wealth business. They now have customers moving their wealth from Morgan Stanley, their assets from Morgan Stanley to Robinhood, because Robinhood allows them no fee trades and allows them access to crypto and everything else. And so if you can see where the incentives are, and the incentives are clear, it's much easier to build solutions for those incentives. And so there are definitely pockets where the market's going to move slower than others, like that.
Very cool. Do we have any more questions? Cool.
Well, thank
Beautiful.
you.
Well,
was
Tom,
awesome.
I appreciate you being able to take your time to join us. Can we
Yeah.
give a nice big round of applause?
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
great what you guys are doing here. It's
Oh.
awesome.
Appreciate you joining. Awesome. So now is going into on the final day of the build station. So demo days tomorrow. So there's going to be a lot of different pitch deck rehearsals, going through everything, getting all ready, and time to get that final submission in. It's cool. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.